Republican Senator Ron Johnson wants to get everyone back to work, including women who can't afford childcare and who were literally forced to stay out of the workforce to take care of their children during the coronavirus pandemic. Now, he was confronted with a common sense question about how unaffordable childcare is and how that is letting or forcing women, I should say, to stay home and leave the job market. And so I want to give you the question from the reporter before I give you his answer, because Johnson actually thinks that the problem now is that wages are too high. It's a big issue. I'm not even kidding. Now, the question from the reporter is this: what about the argument that this situation is kind of shining a light on some of the out of control costs, the increase in costs that wages haven't kept up with for folks like things like childcare? A lot of women are choosing not to go back into the workforce right now because at the end of the day, it's a complete wash. Their wages would simply cover the cost of having to pay for childcare that they don't have to pay for now. That is an excellent question from a local news reporter, and I want to commend him for that. Now, unfortunately, he's talking to a buffoon, and he got a buffoonish answer in response. Ron Johnson responded by saying that, the problem is wages are actually too high. He says businesses pay what wages they can afford based on the competitive situation, whether it's in a restaurant, whether it's in manufacturing, where they're competing against foreign manufacturers. I just have greater faith in the marketplace setting appropriate wage rates. But there's no doubt about it, wage rates are now being bid up because there is a labor shortage. And if you're a worker, that's a good thing. But then he continues to make the case that higher wages are actually really hurting everyone. This is what he says: increase in wage rates ratchet up, and that creates permanent inflation. You can hear the GOP repeating the word inflation over and over again, and they're deflecting by blaming the wrong reasons, right? So you may feel good about getting a 5 or 6 or 7% raise, but if general inflation is 6, 7, or 8%, that increase is just completely wiped out. That's what the marketplace does. I am highly concerned that what we're looking at right now is a witch's brew with all the ingredients for stagflation. So what he's referring to here is, and I'm sure many of you have experienced it, an increase in prices for honestly things that people need to survive. You might have noticed that the cost of housing, for instance, has gone up considerably. And part of the reason why is because there is honestly a higher price for lumber. The production of lumber was halted during the pandemic. It takes a while to get the process back up and running again. And so as there's a lack of supply and higher demand for housing, obviously it's going to drive up the cost of housing. But that's just part of the equation. Let's also talk about the fact that interest rates have provided cheap money to investors who then take that money and buy up all these houses as investments, as speculators. He doesn't talk about that. He doesn't talk about raising interest rates that have been ridiculously low for quite some time now by the Federal Reserve. He doesn't want to talk about that because he and his cronies benefit from that. But when it comes to wages, he's going to go ahead and blame that for inflation, and that is not the story here.
So Anna makes a sophisticated argument, and the facts about inflation versus wages are really important. And I want to get back to some of that in a second. But let's just note that a Republican senator, a United States senator, just said your wages should be lower, not higher.
Yep.
That's amazing. And so that would never happen in a normal democracy. Even if they actually believe that, they would normally hide it if they thought the voters actually decided elections. But Ron Johnson is of the mind, and he has historically been right for the last 40 years. Now, since the Just Democrats have come on board, the equation has changed a little bit. But he's been largely right that no, donors decide elections. So Ron Johnson is going on television and saying, yeah, I work for big business. I want your wages to be lower. I mean, it's spitting in the face of the voters. It's, oh man, if your wages go up, I mean, we might have inflation. By the way, but you would also have higher wages, right? I mean, what an unbelievable excuse to work for big business and keep you down and oppress you. I don't want you to have higher wages, it might cause inflation. Well, how about when the executives had giant pay raises and giant bonuses? And how about when they did the stock buybacks and all those things? How about when the Fed printed all that money and gave it to all the companies? You weren't worried about inflation then. But you guys authorized $2 trillion to go right in the beginning of the COVID relief thing, immediately to big business. And then the Fed authorized another $4 trillion. And you weren't worried about inflation. It was $6 trillion on the line. But now when the workers might get a $1 raise or a $2 raise per hour, you say, oh, now all of a sudden I'm worried about inflation. No, they're brazen, man, they're brazen. You vote for Ron Johnson, you're an idiot, unless you're a billionaire or you run a giant corporation. He's telling you, I want your wages as to be as low as humanly possible so my big business friends can win. Now back to the details of that, right? So he says, I have faith in the markets. No, but wait a minute, guys, markets are real and they do set prices, but they don't exist in a bubble, right? So it's the job of the government to hold corporations accountable. It's the job of corporations to maximize profits. If you let corporations set wages, they would set them at near starvation wages, right? They'd get it so that you could barely live, and then they would take all the profits on top, because it would keep their costs literally as low as humanly possible. Now, the government is supposed to step in and protect us in a democracy through different things like regulations. One of them is the minimum wage. One of them, by the way, is a 40-hour work week. Before, we didn't have a 40-hour work week. We didn't have weekends because we had no unions to protect us and we had no democracy to protect us, right? Now we do, or we used to, and now Ron Johnson and the corporate overlords have taken over again and say, no, you should not have any protections if you're an actual American worker. And you should like it. And so, let alone his views on women getting back to work. These guys are disgusting. And the only reason why anybody votes for them is that the press calls everything even and helps them lie to you guys.
Now, I also want to provide some data in regard to where American wages have been and compare wages and how they've fared with inflation, because inflation has continued for decades and decades and decades. The question is, have wages outpaced inflation? And spoiler alert, no. But before I get to that data, I want you to ask yourselves a question, because I'd love an answer. What exactly are parents supposed to do with their children if they're not making enough money to afford childcare? What are they supposed to do? Leave them home alone? I would like all of these so-called pro-life Republicans to explain to me what parents are supposed to do with their children if they can't afford childcare in this country that provides no social safety net for parents who have young children. That's the question I want to ask. Now let me get to the data. There's been a lot of data on US wages and how they have not kept up with inflation. I'm gonna give you a few data points right now. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics generated compensation cost indices, total benefit costs for all civilian workers have risen an inflation adjusted 22.5% since 2001 when the data series began versus 5.3% for wage and salary costs. So it continues. This is from Pew Research. After adjusting for inflation, today's hourly wage has just about the same purchasing power as it did in 1978, following a long slide in the 1980s and early 1990s, and bumpy, inconsistent, that's important, inconsistent growth since then. That's when inequality really started to explode. In fact, in real terms, average hourly earnings peaked more than 45 years ago. The $4.03 an hour rate recorded in January of 1973 had the same purchasing power that $23.63 would today. That's nowhere near what the federal minimum wage is. The current federal minimum wage is $7.25. Minimum wage jobs pay that amount. Nothing close to $23.68. This indicates that the hourly wage for minimum wage jobs has not in any way kept up with inflation. Let me give you more. This is from 2000 to 2013. The dark blue line shows how productivity has increased through the decade, but you also see that the hourly compensation has stagnated. So Americans are actually working much harder and receiving less compensation for the hard work that they're putting in. But you might be thinking, well, that's 2000 to 2013. I mean, do we have any evidence that that trend continued? Yeah, let me show you some data from 2019 that shows the same trend. This is from Bloomberg. They use data from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and it shows that pay hasn't kept pace. It's very easy to see, and it's easy to also witness for yourself out on the streets with so many Americans living in poverty or in RVs or giant encampments because they can't afford a home.
Yeah, so I want to give you guys some context. Those graphs that Anna just showed you, the divergence starts around 1978. I'll talk about it a lot in my book, Justice is Coming, book.com. You can pre-order there. And it's because of a couple of Supreme Court decisions that allowed corporations to give unlimited money to politicians. That happened well before Citizens United. And then you immediately see the divergence as they purchase all of our politicians and keep our wages low while productivity is high. The difference between 1978 and now in those charts is the difference between productivity and the wages is about $12 trillion. So they took $12 trillion of your productivity and gave it to the richest people in the country and the world instead of you. You earned it, but you didn't get it. But now Ron Johnson spits in your face and says, if we give you any, the inflation might go up. But as Anna showed you, it did go up. If our wages had kept up with inflation, instead of being $7.25 right now for minimum wage federally, it'd be over $23. $23. Now we're trying to get $15 and we can't get it. That 8 Democrats voted. That's too. And that's, by the way, that's $15 in 5 years, right? And even 8 Democrats joined with the Republicans go, no, my corporate backers say it's way too much. Well, it would have been 23. How about the inflation point that Ron Johnson made? Oh, no, we only use that to keep wages low. We never, ever talk about it when it would mean that wages would be higher. And finally, back to the original point about Ron Johnson, they asked him, hey, how is a woman supposed to go back to work if she's got kids and she needs money for childcare? His answer was basically, I don't give a damn, and I want to keep her wages as low as possible, and I don't want to give her daycare, and I don't want to give her unemployment.
But I want to force her to go to work, because that's what the point of that entire interview was. He's terrified that people are not going back to work because the unemployment benefits that they're receiving as a result of the coronavirus relief package is persuading them to stay home. So what he's doing, along with other Republicans like him, he's running interference on behalf of corporations who don't want to compete with the nickels and dimes that the federal government is offering to the American people who are experiencing hardship. They don't want to increase their wages. They don't want to compete, again, with the federal government's unemployment program, which is not in any way overly generous. So they get these Republicans, and oftentimes corporate Democrats as well, to run interference on their behalf, because that's what they're paid to do, guys. That's what the campaign donations force them to do, persuade them to do. They don't represent you. Ron Johnson is not representing the best interests of constituents in Wisconsin. He couldn't care less. What he cares about is, of course, his own political career, which is really dependent on the campaign donations from these corporations who don't want to pay you a fair wage, a living wage.
You vote for these big business Republicans, you're out of your mind, unless you run a giant business. Last word goes to our viewers because they made a bunch of good points. Jake Fisher says on YouTube Super Chat, as a single parent, what have I heard? What I have heard was, and always has been, get a better paying job. Like they just grow on trees or something. That's how cruel and heartless most politicians are, because they don't know anybody that doesn't have millions of dollars in savings. They're all millionaires. All they know is millionaires and billionaires. So they're like, oh, why don't you just get a higher paying job? Oh, I didn't think of that. Thanks for letting me know. And then lastly, YTP Renewed, also on YouTube Super Chat, said, businesses can't afford $15 an hour? Tell it to Denmark. It's a great point. You know how much an average McDonald's worker makes in Denmark? $23 an hour. Do you know how much more expensive their burgers are? About 70 cents more than on average American burger. Okay, in McDonald's, same thing. Okay, and now I'm rounding up on the burger price. So, oh no, they can't do it. Oh wow, the burger costs $5.99 instead of $5.29, and they pay $23 a worker. But the most important part of it is, well, did McDonald's go bankrupt when they paid that much to the workers and the burger cost 70 cents more? No, they make a great profit in Denmark. perfectly great company doing unbelievable profits in Denmark. They choose to continue to work there and choose to make tons of money in Denmark. It turns out you can pay your workers more, you just don't want to, and you got away with it because you bought all these corporate Republicans and corporate Democrats, and they sold out the American people on your behalf. That's the reality. Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.